Good evening, everybody. Welcome to the Houses of Parliament and to the House of Lords End, and a special welcome to my colleagues from what's described as the other place, the House of Lords. So I'm Stephen Metcalfe. I co-chair the all-party parliamentary group looking at artificial intelligence, along with my colleague Lord Clement Jones, who unfortunately is unable to be with us this evening. But you're all very welcome. Particular welcome to our panel. Thank you for joining us and finding time to explore the interesting exam questions that we have set for this evening, which I'll come to in a minute. This is our 7th evidence session of this year. We are a busy and active all-party parliamentary group, and that's partly to do with, or mainly to do, I should say, to do with the support that we receive from the Big Innovation Centre, for which we will forever be grateful. You do a fantastic job for us. Keep us on track and keep us very busy, which is great. I mean, most recently we launched at a press conference sort of an overview of the AI landscape in the UK. This is kind of the small executive summary. The actual report itself that tracks who is influential, who in terms of business, research, coverage of AI, policymakers, actually runs to think over 2,200 pages. Consequently, we haven't printed it out. It is available online, but there is a shorter executive summary also available online, which does make quite interesting reading and provides a list of all those companies and people who are active in this field, which I think is excellent. And it was a well-covered report. The launch got a lot of coverage in the press and a well-attended press conference. So please have a look for that. The other document I would like to draw your attention to is the Embracing the AI Revolution, which lays out our programme as a all-party group for 2019-2020. And one of the innovations in that is to create expert task forces, I should say, to look at 3 particular areas. So again, please have a look at that. One of the ones that maybe I think will be quite interesting, and we may well touch on this evening, is citizen participation in AI, how we make sure that the citizens, certainly I as an elected representative, look after, understand the potential opportunities and challenges that the rollout of AI in all its forms potentially presents. So I'm sure there'll be more detail on that, and Brigitte and the team will be emailing round to those on the list, inviting comments and things in due course. So, as I said, this is our, just before I come on to that, actually one final thing, which is a date for your diary. We have our Christmas reception on the 3rd of December. Details of that, again, will be emailed round in due course. And I understand that the board has to meet because we had a competition at last year's Christmas reception, which was to work out how Santa might use AI to improve his delivery methods and distribution of presents to the right people, an AI to sort out the good from the bad list. So even good children get Christmas presents, as we all know. So we've got to meet to decide what this year's competition will be, and once that's decided, details will be forthcoming. So on to this evening's evidence session. So it's session number 7, and as the year draws to a close, I suppose it is appropriate that we start to look at what the next steps, the next practical steps are in addressing or making sure that we remain one of the world's leading AI proponents. And it's what role we as the UK can have in that. And so the 4 primary questions that we want to explore this evening with our panel is, as I said, what are the practical steps of setting international rules, norms and standards? What is our vision of the new AI and a data-driven world? What does it mean to be human in 2025 and beyond that in 2052? Which is quite a long way from now. I mean, it will come round quicker than one might imagine, but to try and envisage a world 30 odd years from now, when probably 30 years ago to envisage the world we're now in would have been quite difficult. So It'd be interesting to hear some of the views on that. And finally, is this a roadmap that should be adopted nationally, or is this an international endeavour? So I think those are the four key questions, and to help us explore that, as I said, we have a fantastic panel. Just before I invite our first contribution from the panel, I don't know, Birgitta, if you want to add anything to that. Have I missed anything from my list?
No, I think you got everything, and I just want to say that for the program for next year, the leaflet, which we have, I have about 30 copies here, so you can have a copy, but everything will be on the website, and we will also be emailing you about everything, so I think everything's perfect.
Everything's fine. Great. In which case, let us start with our first contribution, which is going to be from Scott Steedman, Scott, who is the Director of Standards at BSI. Welcome again. We've heard from you before, so it's great to have you back. We've got 5 speakers, so we're going to try and keep quite tightly to time. I think each of you have got 5 minutes. I hope that's been communicated to you. Scott, please go ahead and
thank you very much, Stephen. Thank you, and good evening, everybody. I'm Scott Steedman, Director of Standards at BSI. We are the UK Standards Organisation, and I'm going to focus on that subject this evening. In many ways, the role of the UK Standards Organisation is to be neutral and independent in this discussion, but to help provide that infrastructure. So we're appointed by government as the national standards body. Every country in the world has one, and my role is to provide the infrastructure for UK experts from industry, government, society, citizens, all communities to create the standards that they need. Our scope is global, and we cover the full breadth of business and industry sectors. So AI is absolutely in the spotlight for us. So for the development of consensus norms and standards, we provide 3 processes to do that. The full international standards process, which I won't go into details of, but it's a major international consensus. What we call a PAS, fast track process, very successful for the UK, and a more digital agile process that's more like software development. Each of them have different attributes, but they're all underpinned by the same core values and principles: open public consultation, full stakeholder engagement, and consensus. So asked to comment on the 3 interconnected areas of international rules, norms and standards, I would say that we support all 3 approaches by offering those WTO compliant standards that can be used to underpin regulation, to support performance-based co-regulatory approaches, and to provide the opportunity for organisations to deliver aspirational performance totally independent of regulation. So this is about what good looks like and how do you do that voluntarily, underpinned by the safety net of some appropriate and necessary regulatory blanket. So just thinking about this national question, it's important to recognise that in the National Catalogue of British Standards, which we're responsible for, over 85% are international standards. We've long since transitioned from the days of the 1950s when we had British standards. We have international standards, and only around 10% of those are actually used with regulation at all. We've transitioned our regulatory model into a much more nudge co-regulatory system where performance-based regulation encourages industry to make progress. So the vast majority of standards, international, European in origin or British standards in origin, are purely used as best practice tools to improve performance and reputation. So our policy in the UK is to approach standards the same way that our stakeholders do, prioritising the global standard first. We want to write that and influence it. Regional second, if there's additional regional specificities that apply in the European space, and then national third, if there's no other international interest. So clearly, to your question, it's an international endeavour. Industry, government and consumers are clear that they only want one national standard or norm or code of practice on any given issue. And so we work to ensure that there are no conflicting standards in the national catalogue, really fundamental part of our policy. And we withdraw around 1,500 standards a year to make sure that there are no conflicting documents in there. So our standards are developed in accordance with international rules, meeting the WTO TBT agreement, and the WTO principles that I've mentioned of open public consultation, engagement and consensus. AI, developing area of strategic importance, we all know that, widely recognised need for standards, including all of these types, addressing ethical issues before the technology becomes ubiquitous. Well, we've been working in this area already for some time. We published a standard on the ethical design of robots 2 years ago, and we're currently working with the US organisation IEEE as the driving force behind an Oceanus initiative. We came up with this name because it stood for Open Community for Ethics and Autonomous and Intelligent Systems. And we're one of the 12 founder members of that group. And we hope that in that international community, which is quite a mixture of different types of organisation, we can facilitate a dialogue, a forum for discussion on, with organisations interested in standards that will support the development of autonomous and intelligent systems with a focus on ethics. So in the APPG for AI and other fora, there have been numerous areas where it's been identified that we need to have a need for standards. Regulatory compliance in the healthcare space, we've talked about before here, safety, terminology, inclusivity, bias, privacy, and others, of course. So ultimately, our role as that UK standards organisation is here to take those areas where government, industry and the citizens, consumers, environmental experts and so on, where we all decide we need to develop and maintain consensus standards, and I need to provide the mechanism for that to happen. So when I spoke here previously, I talked about various national strategies in AI, but in addition to the stakeholder requirements, given the global nature of technology development, the goal for all participants is international standardization, which incorporates the widest possible range of stakeholders and recognition. Practically, I'd say that given the speed of change and the potential societal impact, there's a need to develop and pilot standards at the European and national level that can meet short-term needs and become base documents for global international standards in due course. And one such example is that standard on ethical design of robots and robotic systems that we published 2 years ago that the IEEE are going to develop further with us. What can the government do? I think UK government's been praised for the approach that's been taken in the sector deal and for driving the role of bodies such as the Alan Turing Institute and the Centre for Data Ethics and Innovation, and that we saw supported further by the Chancellor in the budget. But again, always more needs to be done if the UK is to assert leadership in the AI standards community. We want a government to really become a key stakeholder around the table when our stakeholders are developing standards. And we'd welcome a much greater input from government officials, civil servants from across departments into standardization. Raise the bar for AI standards. Don't keep on thinking we have to reinvent it. We have an extremely powerful international tool for doing this, and we just need to use that properly. So use BSI properly, I might say. Secondly, let's get involved with the wider stakeholder community and let government bring that insight into the plans for regulation to the discussion, because the critical thing about standards is how they sit alongside and deliver the effect in a co-regulatory manner. That's the most efficient way to get the value out of standards. And thirdly and finally, if government views global standards leadership as being an important part of UK leadership in aspects of AA such as governance and public acceptance, then really we need to invest to develop a roadmap and a strategy that the community can endorse. That I feel we've done at national level in connected autonomous vehicles. We haven't yet done that in AI. And of course it will plug into international roadmaps, but we have to do it and get our house in order first. We're very happy at BSI to continue that discussion, Stephen. Thank you.
Thank you very much indeed. That's very interesting. I hadn't realised that the majority of the standards were enforced not through regulation but through nudge.
Yes.
Do you think in this case nudge would be enough?
Yes.
Okay.
And you can see that if you have the right stakeholders in the room, and there are some in this room who realise that reputation is critical, then nudge is a very effective way. You have to be very clear about the regulatory safety net, but then you use the issue of reputation, consumer expectations, citizen pressure to ensure that the standards are not written by industry alone, but written in a consensus way, and they can drive aspirational performance faster than you will ever regulate it.
Yes. Well, that's good. Thank you very much for that. There'll be time for further questions later, so get your thinking caps on. But to build on that, I'm now going to ask Professor John McDermid. I hope that's right.
It is.
Good. Director of Assuring Autonomy International Programme at the University of York. John.
Thank you very much, and thank you very much for the opportunity to speak to you. I've got over 30 years' experience in research, education and consultancy on the safety of complex computer-controlled systems. As the chairman says, I currently run the Assuring Autonomy International Programme. This is funded by the Lloyd's Register Foundation at the University of York. It's a £12 million 5-year programme, which sounds like a lot, but it's not when you see how big the challenges are. And it's trying to address the global challenges in assuring the safety of robotics and autonomous systems. That's relevant here because many of these systems use artificial intelligence and machine learning. What we're trying to do is to conduct research on some of those underlying technical issues, develop education and training materials, but I think most importantly, supporting projects building real-world demonstrators to address the assurance and regulatory issues alongside those. And finally, we want to work to influence the development of standards and regulations for safety. Turning to the first of your questions about practical steps for setting rules, norms and standards. Actually, these tend to be domain specific. So if you look at the maritime sector or aerospace or automotive, the standards are different. I actually think that's a problem. At the technical level, for example, the assurance of machine learning, I believe there's real merit in developing domain-independent norms and standards, and it's possible to do so. You've already heard from Scott Steedman that I think the BSI and other bodies such as the ISO have a major role to play there. I think in the regulatory space, the rules and norms are going to have to be more domain specific because, for example, acceptable risk of driving on the road versus acceptable risk of travelling at sea, I think is quite different. Further, the bodies with regulatory authority are different and often international, so trying to get 192 different countries to agree a set of norms and regulations across 20 different domains is a pretty horrendous task, and I think one we probably shouldn't take on. Technology moves fast. Standardization moves very slowly. One of the major standards in this area, it took 13 years to produce the first issue. It was obsolete before it was published, although the authors hate me saying that. So what Scott was saying about these publicly available specifications and other agile methods are really important. I think pragmatically we have to work locally, work fast, and then use what we develop with a sort of a first mover advantage to influence people globally, and I think the BSI is in a good position to do that, but we need collaborations to draw in organisations with different skills from industry, from academia, from the regulatory world. We was asked this question about, is the roadmap national or international? It has to be international. If we have international rules and norms, then it means that developers don't have to comply with lots of different standards in different countries. That drives cost and it reduces competitive ability of the organisations. There are international bodies in many of the domains, for example, the International Maritime Organisation in the marine sector. So we have to take the lead, we must take the lead, but we have to influence these international bodies to avoid UK suppliers, UK developers of systems being disadvantaged by working to standards that are not harmonised across the globe. There were two questions about government and parliamentarians. So what should Parliament do? Again, as Scott says, the government actually has a good track record through various departments such as BASE. The funding is a really important work. I think there are some key things to do in assurance. I think they need to find funding mechanisms to support working cross-domain on assurance, and the International Strategy, whatever it is, Science Challenge Fund, Industrial Strategy Challenge Fund, sorry, is I think one of the key ways of doing that. The fact that these standards can work cross-domain may be quite surprising, but I actually was at Race at Cullum earlier today talking to people developing nuclear fusion reactors, but also they have involvement in autonomous cars. actually there's surprising commonality in the technical challenges and the solutions in those domains. Of course, they're not the same, but we can get real value out of finding those things that are common and using them across multiple domains. As I said earlier, regulation has to be domain specific, and I think the Regulators Pioneer Fund that has been set up recently is again a really great mechanism for supporting that. Regulators necessarily have to be quite conservative. This fund enables them to be innovative, and I think it's a really, really good thing to do, and I would encourage it. We're asked what should parliamentarians do? Is take advice. There's a lot of hype, there's a lot of things said that actually plainly aren't true, don't stand real scrutiny. There was an announcement recently by a company that was going to have autonomous taxis in London by 2021. And the next day they stepped back and said, actually, no, we aren't. We're going to have some sort of mobility stuff with safety drivers, because lots of people said, no nonsense, you can't do that. And they backed off within 24 hours. But if people hadn't commented, they may have been believed. So I think one way of getting good advice that's well informed but is also independent is through the Royal Academy of Engineering. The Fellows of the Academy have a vast amount of expertise in this area, and I'm sure we'll be happy to support parliamentarians in that role. Thank you.
Excellent. Thank you, John. That was, a lot of ground covered in that, and thank you for that. I think the final point around parliamentarians taking advice when they hear some of these more outlandish claims is a very good point, and one that we should pick up to make sure that we communicate how colleagues can get advice when they hear an AI machine learning algorithmic story, to find out what the reality is. So thank you for that, and we will take that further. Right, onward. Can I welcome Christina Blacklaws, who is the President of the Law Society. Christina, over to you.
Thank you very much, Stephen. I'm delighted to be here. Before I was President of the Law Society, I have had a history in innovation. So I set up one of the first virtual law firms. I set up the first ABS with the Co-op Legal Services, and my last role was as a Director of Innovation for a big law firm. So unsurprisingly, innovation, and particularly technical innovation, has been a key theme of my time as an office holder. And what I wanted to do today is to share with you some thoughts on the ethical implications of AI, and specifically the work that we've been doing at the Law Society. So we have set up a technology and law policy commission where we have brought together, convened if you like, the technologists, the lawyers, the academics, the policymakers and government to examine the issues surrounding ethics and AI. I chair this commission, but my co-commissioners are a professor of ethics and a professor of computer science, because we really feel that we need to get everybody engaged to be able to address these really challenging issues. So the commission is an ongoing exploration, in fact a year-long exploration of the impact of technology and big data on human rights in the justice system. So we're looking at the future use of algorithms in the justice system in England and Wales, but looking at the implications more broadly than that. So how do these impact on human rights, on fundamental freedoms and the rule of law? For example, how can we ensure that algorithms and big data use by the justice system are ethical, fair, free from bias? And who is liable, because I'm a lawyer, if a decision by an algorithm proves to have a negative or a harmful consequence? We have held one live evidence session, which we run a bit like a select committee, so it's good theatre. Our next session is next week on the 12th of November at the Law Society. You are welcome to attend. We will have 14 witnesses then from the technical world. In fact, Lord Clement Jones is going to be a witness for us, so looking forward to that. At the end, we're going to have other sessions. In fact, one will be focused on civil society to ensure that we have that voice very clearly heard. We will, at the end of this, so next spring, have some conclusions and insights that we want to present to government around this. But at this stage, I can share with you some fairly early insights. Firstly, that many of the algorithmic tools that are already being used, or most likely to be used in our justice system, escape the scrutiny and the safeguards introduced by the GDPR, because there is effectively a human in the loop. Secondly, given the evidence documenting the considerable impact of so-called automation bias, we believe that scrutiny obligations should extend to all use of automated systems within our justice system. So this would entail an obligation to register particular uses of algorithmic tools, to provide continuous access and to allow that scrutiny. It would also require training and retaining a suitably skilled interdisciplinary team capable of such insight. Our concern is immediately around the use of prediction tools, which we believe are most likely to have the most significant and immediate impact on our justice system. One particular difficult and pressing issue consists of tackling what we would term the conservatism effect, which is likely to result from fewer cases being brought and certainly fewer cases with lower chance or perceived lower chance of success being heard. This will impact our common law system, would lead potentially to a seizing up and certainly a change in the organic development in which our legal system currently evolves. And finally, a concern that at the moment automation tools are mostly developed by commercial companies for commercial purposes. And given the public good that the justice system serves, we say that there is a strong case for seeking to address the likely imbalances generated. So, for example, if you think of Amazon's recommendation system, it's clearly aimed at maximising the number of sales. But you could envisage, and there could be a very strong case, for building an alternative recommendation system that aims to broaden its users' horizons as much as possible. And what about the tools that have been currently developed in our justice system? Where is the public interest element? We have identified some other issues, and I'll briefly run through these and come on to some of the ideas that we have to address this. So issues around if algorithms do make wrong decisions, what steps do we need to take for quality assurance of the software? What remedies will be available to people if wrong conclusions have been reached? And secondly, an issue of basic values. So is it appropriate, even if we can envisage that algorithms do not make any errors, and that automated decision making does not raise any ethical concerns, are we content with decisions entirely made by machines and effectively subjecting citizens to control by computer? Is there anything inherently undignified in having sanctions applied by a machine to a human being? So these issues have been raised by witnesses at this stage, and the concerns that they have addressed in our evidence sessions have been around the use of algorithms in the justice system having the potential to provide enormous benefit or devastating consequences. And that depends on how they're coded, the data that they use, the situations and circumstances in which they're used, the knowledge of the users and the perceived fairness and legitimacy of the algorithms. The key question for us is how we can ensure that algorithms are used in the right areas, using the right and unbiased data sets in a way that is fair, non-discriminatory, and that where there is a proper level of human oversight and remedies for the users and those on the receiving end of decisions. There are various models that can be used to achieve those aims, but so far we've heard from a lot of experts who are suggesting that we need, at the very least, a multidisciplinary panel of experts from various sectors. We have an example already with human embryology that would approve or accredit specific algorithms for use in defined circumstances according to a clear set of criteria, both ethical and practical. We're also supporting government's the recommendations for the House of Lords, but I won't go into that. But one thing I did want to just raise, and perhaps we might have some questions on it later, is the Law Tech Delivery Panel, which is government-backed, industry-led body, which again I have the privilege to chair. And the purpose of this panel is to do two things principally. One is to develop, to scale, and to have inward investment to enable a flourishing law tech community in the UK. But the second is to ensure that we have the right regulatory and legislatory and, because of our common law basis, the right decisions in relation to all types of technology, so that people will use English law for their contracts, and they will bring their technology issues to the UK for consideration and determination. So the ultimate aim here is to enable the UK to become a world leader in law tech. And the ethics panel that I've talked about will be feeding very much into that decision making.
Thank you very much indeed. Some very interesting stuff in there. I did particularly like the comment of you need to know where the liability lies as a lawyer. And I suppose that does bring up a question around, certainly in the early days of deployment of machine learning and algorithms, that the right to challenge has to be available to all, not just those who perhaps can afford to litigate and afford to go through a challenging process. And it would be interesting at some point to hear back from you around your thoughts of how that might be achieved.
Yeah.
Because I think what we don't want is those who effectively are excluded. I mean, as a Member of Parliament, I'm already seeing cases of decisions where constituents have been disadvantaged by an AI but have no right to, or no way of currently of challenging it. So we need to start addressing that. So thank you for those comments. Excellent. Right, we will move on, and I'm going to invite Adrian Joseph to talk to us next, who is the partner for AI and Advanced Analytics at EY. Adrian, welcome.
Yes, thank you, and good evening, everybody. So in addition to being the partner at EY that leads artificial intelligence, I also advise the UK government. So I'm a non-exec director with the Home Office and also the Cabinet Office. So I sit on the data board at the Home Office. I sit on the ethics in AI boards for the Home Office as well. And before joining EY, I was, this is 18 months ago, I was at one of the top 3 big tech companies for over a decade, leading teams of data scientists, cloud computing and innovation teams. So I thought I'd cover 4 things. Some of the myths and reality to start with, some predictions we were asked to cover, some of the challenges, and then a couple of recommendations. So if we start with the sort of myth versus reality, the fact versus fiction, myth number 1, that we will have a general AI, that is highly unlikely, even I think by 2052. It's hard for me, having worked in a big tech company, to even predict beyond 5 years. That's not a time horizon that many of the technology companies would perhaps envisage. So, but we don't see that happening anytime soon. It'll be singular applications and not a generalized AI. Myth number 2, AI will take all the jobs. Unlikely. We've seen some statistics that suggest that probably only 5% of jobs will be truly displaced by AI, but 95% of jobs will be affected, i.e. at the individual task level, we will see quite a change in all jobs, but probably very few jobs will be truly replaced. Third myth is that AI will only be for the technological elite, for the big tech companies, whether they're the US ones or the Chinese ones or others. That we do not believe to be true. And if you look at some of the cloud platforms, for example, of the big technology companies, they're embedding their best AI and best machine learning capability into their platforms so that the public sector, private sector use them more. So there will be democratization of AI, but I think the challenge will be that it'll be a few of the very big technology companies who have the core competencies and capabilities. So then on to a few predictions. First one is that AI will be colorblind. I said color, not colorblind. Possibly call it colorblind as well. We have seen situations where actually AI has helped improve diversity of outcomes that we should also be aware of. But the fact is that it'll not just affect white-collar jobs, blue-collar jobs, I mean, but also many white-collar jobs will be affected, from brain surgery through to warehouse work, for example. Prediction number 2 is that the most powerful combinations will be the person and the machine. Person and machine will outperform either the person or the machine. Give an example of cancer diagnosis. So surgeons, oncologists very rarely predict false negatives, but they fail to spot all true false positives. But machines are really good at spotting true positives, but often predict false positives. So together we get a much better solution. Third is there will be really uneven adoption of AI, both at an industry level and at a country level. Some of the industries that are more progressed in this space, healthcare, for example, Tim Cook from Apple has described self-driving cars as the mother of all AI. So I would observe that probably autonomous vehicles and the car industry has probably made more advances compared to one of the industries that I work in, financial services, or in the public sector, where I think adoption is somewhat slower. At the sort of national level, we've seen, I think the UAE were the first country to hire or put in place a minister for artificial intelligence. I think China followed fairly swiftly afterwards, and I do know, of course, all of the great work that we're doing in the UK, a lot of it, not all of it, and you know, clearly part of the conversation we're having today is how do we continue to ensure that we stay at the forefront. DeepMind was bought by Google in 2011, 75 people, £500 million. Where, you know, how do we create more deep minds that have impact across the public sector, the private sector, and for social good. The final sort of one on predictions is that we'll see convergence of technologies. So I spoke about cloud computing and the intersection of cloud and artificial intelligence, and then if we think, you know, towards 2052, possibly 2025, quantum computing may become a reality for us. So the ability not just to manage massive data sets, and we've seen exponential growth in data. I believe we will soon see hyper-exponential growth in data. We then need the capability, the compute power to be able to manage those large data sets. So the convergence of technologies that will enable us to answer questions that we haven't probably even contemplated. So some of the challenges, one is around data. We talk a lot about AI, but actually a lot of very talented data scientists that we employ lament that they spend 40 to 70% of their time doing data wrangling, doing data hygiene, doing data quality. Well, that is a big challenge for us. So having confidence in the data, and actually we can use artificial intelligence to improve data quality. So some of these hard challenges we can use the technology actually to help us with. The second is about trust. Trust in the data, but also trust in the algorithms. So both in the data and in the machines, and both of those being critical. And then the third challenge really is about skills. I would imagine that the big technology companies could probably hire all of the data scientists, and there still wouldn't be enough to go around. My understanding, and I haven't verified this point, is that something like 90% of the world's data scientists have only been data scientists for less than a year. So let's make sure that we have the real data scientists who who truly know what they're doing, who have the experience, who have the capability and grounding. And on the skill side, broaden it out. It's not just about data science skills. There's a lot about data as well, of course, but in ethics, in arts, in creative subjects. It's a much broader conversation in philosophy that needs to factor into how we think about artificial intelligence. So 3 recommendations very quickly. One is around trust and having a framework for trust. Things like looking at bias, resiliency, explainability and transparency. And I don't think we need transparency in every single use case. There are situations where we can use neural nets that will be safe applications of it. But there will be other situations where we will want entirely clear and transparent views of the algorithms. Second is around governance. We really do have to have strong governance, ethical guidelines, codes of conduct and codes of practice, I believe, to be very important to us. The questions of, can we and should we should feature very highly. And things like the auditing of algorithms, due diligence on algorithms is an area that we spend a lot of time looking at. I think the institutions and regulators working with organisations need to come together. And then the final recommendation is around education and skills development, ensuring that truly it is embedded in STEM subjects at the right ages. Apparently, our young students make some decisions about their careers between the ages of 7 to 9. So, in trying to make this accessible to them, understandable to them early on is really, really important. And we can use technology, and I've seen a number of applications of this that will predict which roles will be affected in an organisation, and then give advice as to what types of retraining and reskilling should be done. So those are the 3 recommendations.
Fantastic. Adrian, thank you very much indeed for that. I think there was you laid out some very interesting points, particularly around predictions, and of course trying to predict 2025, 2052 when you come from an environment where 5 years is a long time. As a member of the Science and Technology Committee, we've just done an inquiry into quantum technologies, and of course quantum computing. There are already 2 schools of thought. That one, it'll be around the corner and it will change everything. To one, it will make no difference whatsoever. We'll just find a new way of filling it up with bigger and bigger data sets. So, very interesting. So thank you very much for that. Right, and finally, but by no means least, can I welcome Dr. Spiros Denaxis?
Yeah.
Excellent. Senior lecturer at the Institute of Health Informatics from UCL. Over to you.
Thank you very much, and thank you very much for the opportunity to address the panel. So, I'm a computer scientist by background, and I'm currently a senior lecturer at UCL at the Institute of Health Informatics, which is also part of the new National Institute funded by the MRC on Health Data Research UK. So my research lab focuses on analyzing electronic health records. So electronic health records are data that get generated when we interact with the healthcare system. If you visit your GP or you get admitted into hospital, and we analyze these data with machine learning and AI amongst other techniques in order to do things like building tools to predict who's more likely to get admitted for a heart attack, or what is your survival following asthma diagnosis and things like that. So we've heard from expert colleagues today on the ethical and the standards and all these different challenges that are associated with the application of AI. So the evidence that I'm going to give today comes as someone who's actually on the ground building and evaluating these tools on health data in order to sort of improve healthcare and human health. And more importantly, as someone who's educating the next generation of data scientists. So at UCL I run the MSc in Health Data Science, which effectively is training the new generation of sort of enactors of this technology and consumers. So the big question, how will an AI-driven healthcare system look in 20, 30, 50 years? And actually, that's very, very hard to predict. So very, very broadly, there are 2 schools of thought on how an AI-fueled future will look like, the utopian one and the dystopian one. I'm more of a fan of the dystopian one, but today I'm going to focus on the utopian one. So, how would a utopian NHS system look like? So it would be a rapidly learning healthcare system. So every single patient interaction with the healthcare system generates data and metadata, and the NHS will be able to process these huge amounts of data using AI and using other methods in order to transform that into actionable knowledge. And this is not just about replacing doctors or anything like that. This is to provide the evidence base by which better clinical care can be delivered. So at the moment, this loop of going from action to knowledge to back to refining that action takes years or decades. And the idea is that in the future it should take sort of minutes or hours, and it should enable the treatment and prevention sort of and better outcomes of patients. So obviously we're not there yet. So I've just highlighted two of the short-term / long-term steps that we can take to achieve this. So we heard about data access, so I second that comment. So at the heart of AI and any other data-driven approach are data. And in the UK, we're actually in a very unique position worldwide because we potentially can have high-quality data from birth to death, spanning primary care, secondary care for the entire population, and that's a very, very unique asset. The problem, however, is that these data are actually siloed, and they're very, very hard to access by researchers, be it academia or industry. And in order to overcome this, we need the government to invest potentially in a national infrastructure to streamline access to these data. So patients should be aware of what data are being recorded, when and by who, when they interact with the healthcare system. And ideally, they should be able to decide who's going to use that data for research and what are the actual tangible benefits of using that data for research. And like we heard before, they should be aware when these data are being used for a clinical decision on their health, and if not, why not? And this is particularly important because our definition of what these data constitute is very likely to change in this huge sort of timeline. So, you can conceive that in 5-10 years, whole genome sequencing will be the norm. So everybody who walks in the hospital will get whole genome sequencing. Or patients might be bringing their own data from smartphones or wearables or other sensors in their house and integrating them in sort of the healthcare system. So the idea is that in parallel with this robust national infrastructure, we need a national/international strategy on converting that data into something that can be used for research. So similar to how genomics converted genomic data for research, we need a phenomics sort of industry, a phenomics discipline to convert data to phenotypic sort of information. So that's the first bit. And the second bit, I completely echo Adrian's comments on the talent pipeline. So I would say, as someone who is training the next generation, that the skills that we're currently focusing are not enough in order to build responsible AI approaches that are robust and are validated. So we should be having a much more broad and diverse knowledge base by which we educate our students. And it should cover things like arts, social sciences, which actually cover and give balance to the ethical, social, and political challenges of applying AI in healthcare. So we should not only focus on algorithmic accuracy, but also focus on the challenges of applying these approaches in healthcare. So to summarize, I think the future of AI in healthcare is fascinating, and there are huge challenges ahead of us, but there are huge opportunities. And the two key topics that I raised were data access and sort of the discipline of converting data into research data sets and strengthening the talent pipeline. And I would like to finish by saying that we should always be rewarding and promoting researchers to go out there and co-develop tools and methods with the patients, the clinicians, and the citizens, because that's the only way that any technology, including AI or whatever it happens in 10, 20, 30 years, will get adopted in the mainstream. Thank you.
Thank you very much indeed. And I like your utopian vision of an NHS, which is you're able to update your health records, predict what conditions you may suffer from at some future point. But of course that requires firstly the patient to accept that their data is going to be flying around the system, and then trust, presumably, that that data or the predictions from that system do not fall into the wrong hands, and that you end up being excluded from access to potential services such as life insurance or whatever, because someone knows more about you than you knew about yourself or would have ever known in the past. And it's I mean, those are big questions that people have got to get their heads around somewhere. But thank you for posing those questions. Excellent. Well, I think we've had 5 very diverse presentations covering a whole range of issues. So I think the best bet now is to throw the floor open. So under the usual rules, can you state who you are, where you're from, and then I'll go round. I'll start with my colleagues here. Stephen.
Thank you very much. Thank you for the presentations, all very fascinating. I'm Stephen Croft, Bishop of Oxford. I'd like to go back to Scott. Scott, you gave us a very good and hopeful interpretation of the regulatory framework with 85% of standards international and only 10% regulated. I just want to, I enjoy the hopefulness of that, but I want to press a little more on what work have you done or needs to be done on analogy in transferring what is helpful in one field across to this particular field. In respect of 4 different kinds of qualities, it seems to me the AI field may need more regulation in the short term rather than less. One is monopoly, that a very small number of companies are involved and not always transparent to scrutiny. The second is transparency, that something about the decision-making processes themselves are often opaque. The third is proportionality, in that when AI is being used on sentencing policy or HR, the effects on people's lives are enormous. And the fourth is velocity, which is the sheer speed of technological development, which you referred to. It seems to me in those 4 ways the development of AI is not analogous to many more stable and transparent technologies, and therefore the weighting towards regulation may need to be greater.
Yes, thank you very much, Stephen. The role of standards is to be a consensus of what good looks like at any time, and we can achieve that in as nimble a fashion as you wish. Of course, when you want to achieve an international consensus, and there are at least 164 countries involved in the ISO system, of which we are a leading player, it is going to take longer. So that's why I emphasised at the beginning of my remarks that we have pioneered new approaches which can deliver a consensus, a fair, open, transparent and engaged consensus in as rapid a fashion as people require. I mean, after all, we wouldn't be serving industry and government and society if we weren't. So I think that point is obvious. There are definitely sectors, and we work across domains. So to think of standards as being something that is domain specific is not correct. The standards of principles cut across all sorts of domains, and they are indeed called horizontal standards in the terminology. And the International Artificial Intelligence Committee has the code name SC42, and it is a very busy and active committee. So people are working at that global international level on trying to get a handle on terminology and the sort of fundamentals are us all speaking the same language in AI. Meanwhile, back here in a more nimble fashion, we are working in the UK on trying to address specific issues as they arise. I mentioned ethical design of robots and the principles that are embedded in that. It's not a technological standard, it's a statement of principles. We've also completed work earlier to the NHS remark on the quality assessment of apps, healthcare apps. There is a standard for that, for example. And I could go on a whole range of specific examples, but what we have not achieved is an overall strategy as to how we should use these citizen-led, frankly, industry, regulator and citizen community consensus tools in a strategic approach to address the issues and pilot them in a way that regulation can't keep up. So my point really is, really we must see the role of standards as an enabler for piloting, experimenting, but transforming behaviours in a nimble and aspirational way, not as some alternative to regulation. Regulation's got to happen anyway, and everybody, that's the level playing field, that's the safety net. See standards as a tool for driving excellence. Velocity I've addressed. Proportionality, again, the key point about anything to do with codes and standards, it is what the people in the room decide it's going to be, as broad or as narrow, as principle-led or as specific as they choose. BSI doesn't write standards. What we do is provide a neutral platform for all the stakeholders to sit around and decide what they need to decide, and then we will move it on as quickly as possible. So it's a tool, it's a very nimble and agile tool that sits alongside the regulator's toolbox in that nudge world that has become very efficient at stimulating innovation.
Thank you. Robin, you want to
Yes, as Robin Janbrin, I'm a crossbench member of the House of Lords. This is not directed at any particular member of the panel, but it came up in different ways throughout your excellent presentations, which is this question of how you develop, or how we develop, a community of cross-discipline expertise that can not only provide the kind of panels and knowledge bases on which we can start talking about regulation, but to pick up an important point, and I think it was John, it was the point, who is going to advise the parliamentarians? Is there are we developing a community, cross-cultural, discipline expertise? Christine, you mentioned law tech, which I thought was a good way of expressing your particular need to find people who have knowledge of both disciplines. And my question, not to any particular member of the panel, is, are we actually developing these cross-cultural, cross-discipline expertise? I can see two hands going up.
John,
I think we are in some limited areas, but it's very difficult. To pick up the healthcare example, we have a PhD student who needs to understand AI, healthcare, safety engineering, and some aspects of human-computer interaction to design effects, and it's really very difficult. You can't do this in a single head. So we need some ways of supporting activities that do draw in people from different disciplines, and there's actually a real difficulty here. The earlier question was about velocity. We need to do some of these things fast, but actually learning to speak across disciplines is actually very slow, because it's not so much we speak different languages, we actually use the same words and we later discover they mean something different, and that's a real impediment to working together. So I think there are some communities where we do share. The law example is one. We try to do that in the program that I run. We've involved philosophers and sociologists, and we will carry on doing so. But I think there needs to be more stimulus for this. I also think there needs to be less stigma in working with others, and often it's very hard to work outside your domain. And I think one bit back to the government, it's actually very hard to get research programs funded in universities that span arts and science, humanities and science, and we need to reduce some of the barriers to doing that.
May I just follow up that question absolutely directly? So tomorrow morning, the Standards Policy and Strategy Committee of BSI will meet. It's the highest level advisory committee in BSI of independents who come together, chaired by the excellent Carol Sargent, independent financial leader. And that committee is the top level committee. Behind that, in every domain and every horizontal issue, including big data and AI, I have strategic committees made up of experts from across the piece. We really search out experts, consumer representatives, whoever needs to be in that room will be in that committee, and we try to make them as diverse as possible, and I'm constantly open to that challenge indeed. So we have those structures in place in perpetuity. Those committees sit and they're working on whatever standards projects are ongoing at any one time. There are 7,000 standards projects ongoing at any one time in BSI, and I have 1,200 committees that sit behind that. So as you drill into that, you can drill into any subject through a horizontal issue or a vertical issue. We try to connect them through analytics so that the experts know who the other experts are. Perhaps when I say experts, that's too grand a term. What I mean is people who are coming from tech companies, who are coming from associations, from consumer background, from environmental or regulatory background, and they're all working together. And this is a kind of hidden part of the the industrial landscape that people really have very little exposure to, including myself, before I found myself in BSI. So the answer to your question is we do it through town halls, through research, and through individual search to ensure that we can populate these strategic advisory committees with as diverse a group as need to be there. The basic fundamental is that everyone affected by that standard must be represented in that group, and that group has a constant mission to be working on whatever's going on, and we will feed them with what's happening at the international landscape and the national landscape. So it's an ongoing journey, but I'm more than happy to present evidence to the group of exactly how that structure works.
Thank you for that. I mean, I thought we were a committee-based organisation, but 1,200 to manage, I think, is quite a feat. Christina, you wanted to make a point on this.
Just very quickly, to support the need for more, because I think it is something that many organisations are coming to a realisation that cross-disciplinary approach is essential. But I'd extend that out. I think it needs to be cross-national boundaries as well, because as we know, none of this is any respecter of national boundaries. So we really have to be internationalist in our approach here. And we also, just to reinforce a point I made in my presentation, we also need to ensure that it isn't just commercial interests, that government has skin in the game, and that is particularly important when it comes to some members of civil society who are at the more vulnerable end. To pick up your point earlier, Stephen, that if we don't give opportunity and proper empowered opportunity for those people to have a voice, then we are missing out on a very, very important an enormous chunk of our society in these discussions and debate.
Thank you for that. Did anyone else want to comment? If not, I can get some more questions. Oh, sorry. Birgitte, you wanted to make a comment or a question?
So my comment is really related to standards, because as we're talking about standards, we're also seeing how industry changed. And we now have what we talk about very much about the tech giants. We have one LinkedIn for jobs, one Facebook for friends, one eBay for auctions, one Uber for taxis, one Airbnb. we have one Google for search. We have these companies are setting the standards very quickly as we are talking. And we also know historically when we try to come in and set standards, with the QWERTY keyboard change that, with the video players. We had more recently, a couple of years ago, Samsung versus Apple, big court case on standards on the screen here. There was a huge court. So my view is isn't the issue not that more matter opening standards, creating open standards in which everybody can come in and compete with, open source codes, open, we had the media player with Microsoft in court case with the European Union. So what are we doing in the field, like the BSI and some of the others, what are we doing in the field of actually opening up standards so we actually can create more clones can come in and compete and be part of the new revolution? So you could actually have several Facebooks or several eBays that actually could communicate.
So I'm going to take that.
Scott,
so
please.
Birgitte raises a very good point, and she's covered the territory there. The world of corporate juggernauts is a very powerful world, and there's no doubt that they have such clout that they can drive proprietary standards through the process. That's why every time I turn on my phone, it says I have to upgrade it. And I'm going, oh, please, not again. I have to accept more conditions that I can't read. So this corporate juggernaut process is something that excludes people. We know that. But actually, the modern world is moving rather rapidly, and it's very clear now that, in fact, corporate reputations depend on being seen to being involved with a wider audience. So I think that the mood music, Birgitte, is that even the corporate juggernauts are very interested in their reputation, and that means that they will retain to themselves proprietary technology written in proprietary standards, but they will open up to participate in other areas, environmental, cyber, risk, all sorts of areas where they need to be seen to be participating with citizens and others in the development of codes of best practice. At the other end of the scale, in the open software, for example, open standards, there's nothing more open than a British standard. Anybody can participate, it's free to participate. You can participate in the international standard, you can participate in SC42 on the International Committee on Artificial Intelligence. And indeed, I would encourage British experts to get on and get engaged, because otherwise other countries will write it for us. And that is not a good place for us to be. So at the extreme end, not on the extreme end, the further down that spectrum you go, you come into an area where technological experts are themselves hacking away and doing stuff in a highly dynamic environment. That's not something that we need to or should indeed control. So there's an entire space around that I would say, great, get on with it. And then if you really want to get into the area of metrology, then you have scientists writing metrology standards. You're not going to get consumers writing a definition of time, for example. So there's a sort of horses for courses thing. But all the time, let's be clear that regulation, the law, is something separate. That's to protect people in the environment. Standards, codes, guidance, there's a wide spectrum of those available for us to use. And again, this point about a national strategy fitting into the international landscape is really fundamental to that. But all the tools are available to us.
Okay. If I can comment very briefly, the programme is going to produce a body of knowledge around assurance and regulation of robotics and autonomous systems. It will be in the public domain. That's part of the conditions of taking part in the programme. Some of the academics have been slightly worried about IP, but actually none of the companies are. They all want to share what they've understood about how to assure these systems, because they know if it's not publicly acceptable, they're not going to be able to sell products. So I'm actually not concerned in that domain. I think it will work in exactly the sort of way that Scott has outlined.
The only final comment I might make, Stephen, if I may, to carry on, is that actually, if you ask consumers, they will tell you we struggle just to follow one process. If it's just open the Wild West, we can't keep up. We cannot cope with that sort of thing. So when we're into areas where we're talking about risk, governance, ethics, and you want a sort of national consensus on that, you need a process that is accessible for people to participate and that they can genuinely have their contribution heard, listened to, and seriously commented on. And that's a process that requires its own level of governance. So that's why we're very clear in the UK that in the national catalogue at least, there's only one standard on any given issue. And that's so that consumers, industry and regulators know where to look and they know where to comment.
Okay. Thank you. Did you want to just make a point?
I mean, just to say,
a brief one if we may, because we've got a lot of hands up.
No, I agree. I just like from the viewpoint of research, what we could be doing is promoting the adoption of standards. So we should be incentivizing people, researchers, to actually adopt standards, create reproducible research, and use open source tools. And the way you do that is through the funders and through creating a culture of enabling that.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, that's right.
Okay, thank you. Right, now I've got lots of hands up, so I suspect people are going to be disappointed, but yes, over to you.
My name is Kathleen Richardson. I'm a professor of ethics and culture of robots and AI at De Montfort University. And my background is in anthropology, so I have observed scientists. And I really appreciate many of the panel's comments, and I very much appreciate the comments here about citizens and citizen participation. Because I would probably say, actually, if you looked inside most of the academic departments that develop these technologies, they aren't actually diverse. And we're not just talking about women being present in the room, we're talking about different viewpoints and frameworks being represented. And there's not just an issue of sex here, there's an issue of class and how different classes get represented, and there's an issue of race and ethnicity as well. So I think, the reality is these expert panels aren't made up of diverse people often. They are made up of very educated, selected people. So that's the first thing I would say. The only other thing I want to say is that the issue about standards, there's about 40 different international standards on AI at the moment. I mean, people keep producing them again and again and again. So I guess I would be very careful about what you're going to do if you're going to create a new standard, because you're going to be just conflicting with all the other hundreds of standards. Maybe you just want a rule like Google: do no harm, don't kill people, don't be evil. And the final point is, The real concern here is what kind of future we're going to have if we make all our decisions based on automation. We're going to create a living museum, and we're just going to be the kind of ornaments or the objects in that museum. And I think that's the real concern about the future, that this is the kind of society, if we automate everything and develop these algorithms around us, we are just going to become artifacts in a museum, and that's going to interfere with our potential as human beings.
Okay, thank you for that. I don't know if anyone wants to pass a comment. Adrian.
Maybe just, a few comments on the diversity. Completely understand that point, well made, and it is a concern. Not just we tend to focus on the physical dimensions of diversity, but in my view, it's the diversity of thought that really matters, and physical dimensions tend to be proxies for that in many cases that we focus on. And we've seen, numerous examples of some of the biggest technology organizations falling foul of bias in algorithms that have led to racial bias or gender bias and a host of other things. On the one about museums, I'm intrigued by that as a thought. You and I make 35,000 decisions every day, apparently, 35,000, 200 just on food, Cornell University believe. And so using AI as a way to take away some of those decisions that we probably shouldn't be spending much time on, but then allows us to focus more on those that are really important, I think is something that AI can help with. So.
Okay, thank you for that. This is a conversation that obviously can go on forever. Right, there was a gentleman at the back. Yes, if you could stand up, and because we're videoing this, so anyone towards the back.
John Royston, University of Bath, not a gentleman. And I have a specific question, believe it or not, and it's going to go to Adrian, but I just want to say very quickly that University of Bath is pitching for a big government grant to have a multidisciplinary across all of our faculty's doctoral training center for accountable and transparent AI. Anyway, speaking of accountable and transparent AI, there were several mentions actually here, Christine, also about liability and about this floor of regulation. Now, my understanding from the document, the excellent document that the House of Lords put out, was that we don't really need that much more new law. We just need to understand how to apply existing liability into artificial intelligence and across software more generally. We don't even have to decide which is the intelligent software. We just need to get a little more professional. And so that's why I'm asking Adrian, you mentioned that you're talking about due diligence, and I'm just, is there more to it than just explain to people about revision control and making sure they do it for their data libraries as well as their software? Tell us what you're doing there.
So, my first comment on that is, and thank you for the pitch, the most opaque algorithm is our brain. We're trying to apply in many instances, frameworks and regulations around decision making for algorithms that we wouldn't apply to ourselves. So, that's just one observation I would make. But I think it really depends on the particular use cases and making sure that we truly understand those which particular types of algorithms can and should be applied, and those which definitely should not be, and there are probably many in between there. So I think it should be use case driven, and I'm not sure that I don't with certainty know that we have all of the frameworks in place already that would enable us to do that, but you may be right.
Thank you.
Very
John, did you want
briefly, in autonomous vehicles, the government produced a new bill on autonomous and electric vehicles, which I think was necessary to have a proper framework for insurance. There's still some issues about liability when it moves over into product liability, which I think will need to be evolved, and the Law Commission is looking at that. So certainly in those sorts of arenas, I don't think the current legal frameworks are sufficient, although Parliament is actually working on it. So I don't think it's as simple as you suggest.
Christine, did you want to come in on that?
Yeah, I think that's right. So we need to explore this and test out our theories, because a lot of what AI gives us is speed, and a lack of transparency in relation to where liability might lie. So if a wheel falls off my car, and I've just had it repaired, I know where to go, but you know, something goes wrong with an algorithm. Is it the data that it was exposed to? Is it machine learning? Who, you know, where does that liability lie? And there may be that we're coming to a sort of game-changing point, effectively, where we are going to have to, instead of looking at the iterative legal process, we might have to be looking at hardwiring the legal and ethical compliance into the algorithm in the way that it is put together. So.
Thank you. There was someone along the front here. Yes, sorry.
Thank you very much. My name is Cyrus. I'm founder of China-Britain AI Summit in London, IET. Baidu, the Chinese Baidu, recently in October, in fact, signed a joint forces with Google and the Silicon Valley in US to ease the fear of AI in China. Of course, this is the first time that we hear that Chinese are concerned about AI and regulations. So it strikes me that in US, the provision of or the introduction of AI ethics and standards are technology unicorn driven or data owners driven or data borrowers, if you see them as the owners of data. And whilst in UK we are more government regulatory bodies, more consulting firms driven in terms of AI. What can UK do to become number one leader in provision of ethics and standards in AI, given that this scenario exists now?
Who would like to have a stat? What do we need to do to become number one? Scott?
Well, I think first of all we need to put our hand up, actually. We need to put our hand up and say we see the technological development at pace in California. That's something going on in that Wild West world, and it's very exciting. But actually there are areas that we, the UK, have a particular interest, governance I think being number one, where we can put our hand up. And should this community decide that it was our national strategy to assert leadership in AI standards globally, but we have to build it from the UK, then simply write that down and we will project that into the international space. The vehicles are there. The vehicles are there and other countries are using them. So of course we're trying to move towards the one voluntary standard used everywhere, but it is all about who puts their hand up, who has the case and who wants to control that space. And I would say, and I said by last evidence, we should assert our position in AI governance and ethics. That's an area where there is a natural place for UK leadership. We have the structures to do that. So that's the place I suggest we look.
Can I add that the potential appetite globally for that, and I think that the GDPR is a good case in point, where actually for many global organisations they are now implementing that as a gold standard across all of their operations. It makes it, I think we said before, it makes it globally transportable, whatever they are doing. And I do think it is a space that we could well occupy in terms of UK development.
Thank you. Birgitte, you just wanted to mention
Just
briefly.
from our 2,200 pages report, what we believe that the UK needs to do, what it can be doing, is very strong in building the whole hub in terms of technology supply chain for AI, investment supply chain, trade supply chain, science supply chain, also governance supply chain. It needs to have all of it, and compared to US and China, we are actually very, very strong building the hub, which is also why we have now also become a hub for foreign direct investment into AI happening in the UK.
Thank you. Right, I've got loads of hands up. I've got a question here and then I'll take the one at the back after that and then we'll try and mop up here. We've got about 8 minutes, so keep them very brief, please.
My name is Jacob Turner. I'm a lawyer and the author of a book on regulating artificial intelligence called Robot Rules. My question is with regards to making legally binding rules. Broadly speaking, there are two ways of doing this. One is that you legislate, Parliament has a say, and two is that you leave things to judges. You allow the common law to take its course. And the question of the panel is, with regards to AI, are there areas where it would be best to leave things to judges, to allow the law to develop flexibly, And are there other areas where it would be better to legislate and to have very definitive, but perhaps more fixed and inflexible rules?
Okay. Thank you. Who would...
May I comment on that?
Go on then, and then I'd like to go to Christina.
Yeah, sure. I mean, I've been an expert witness in some complex cases, and I think it's clear that there are some things that you can only really deal with in that sort of situation. But I think there probably are one or two sort of critical areas. Explainability is one, but also if you look at things like autonomous driving, I think it's fundamentally important that we're able to do forensic analysis following accidents and incidents. So I think some things where we do need to set down some regulations so you can independently assess such situations. Exactly what that says is I don't know, and that might be an area of next steps, trying to define where regulations are necessary and where it's better to be much more permissive.
Thank you.
Yeah, I think that's right, and I think it is a combination, isn't it? What I don't think we should be doing is having a really heavy regulatory hand at the moment. I do think we need to see how the common law develops. Let's get some cases into our courts and find out. That will also give us some information as to whether we need legislation, because there is a limit to how you can develop through judicial decision making. But I do think there is an important point about the vulnerability of either the end user or those who are impacted by it. So there's a sliding scale, I would say, as to where you need to require a legislative or a regulatory intervention, and where you can just let the market develop and then take a light touch approach.
But we already have that structure. I mean, our market regulation framework in the UK is already structured like that. So we have high-risk devices, medical devices for one, which are highly regulated, and then we have the vast majority of products and services which are not regulated. And it's voluntary. Of course, there's law there, do no harm, and that's tested in the court. So we have a spectrum already available to us where we can choose where particular aspects of AI should sit.
Okay. Thank you. At the back there, yes. And then we'll take it to in a minute.
Independent consultant, I also worked on the review of when they got into century last year. I want to put forward the proposition that we should be focusing a great deal more on making the UK a leader in assured AI. Because I'm very glad to see John here. I think there is a concern in industry that ethics without practical assurance is opinions and aspirations. And I think a lot of people in industry fear that a focus on ethics will just hold the UK up. I think focusing on assurance is both positive for industry, and we've already got very good R&D, university R&D going in it, like what John's doing with Lloyd's Register Foundation. I think it makes our aspirations to ethics real, but also we have a very large legal and business services sector which is watching the lower end of its business being eaten by AI and frankly needs something else to do. And the opportunity for the UK to become actually a positive centre for assuring AI, which is both technical but compliance, regulation, audit, right way to assess and inspectable group. Does that make sense?
It makes sense to me, but let's...
If so, who needs to bring all of these players together?
Well, that's a different question. So who can coordinate that?
Well, in the
convening power.
The assurance is best driven, in our view, by the market, because it is those companies, those industries, those consumers who are demanding assurance. But it's a very effective tool then. You're absolutely right. And encouragement to develop assurance tools that would work with particular standards or regulations or some combination of those would be very successful. And we've seen that governments use that approach in the environmental space. They've used that approach where assurance against a certain standard means that company is less likely to be inspected, for example. So there's lots of nimble ways to do it, but it's a market-led activity.
Yeah, I think developing the technology of assurance, has to be done collaboratively across industry, across research organisations as well. No one has a monopoly of understanding and wisdom on this. So you've got to do that in an open way, and the government can support that, and it does through some of the programmes it funds. But I also think you need to involve the regulators, and maybe their HSE can take a role. Obviously, it regulates particular sectors, but it also has a broad remit across the country, and looking at how you shape our regulatory framework, actually back to some of the original questions are asked, is also very important.
Thank you. Right. Right in the centre there, yes?
I'd like to ask, in a sense, what's the elephant in the room. If we look back 60 years in terms of global governance, has there been any change? I mean, the answer is no. The Security Council has operated in essentially the same way over the last 60 years. But in the tech, in AI, I mean, over the last 60 years, total transformation. So if we project forward, we see is a governance going to suddenly leap into great, to transform itself and to be much more effective over that period. And one goes fast, the other goes slowly. So my concern about the whole, this group, in fact, it is all about supporting the development of AI, which is fine, and has a great future. But at the same time, everybody knows that if it goes too far, it takes control. And so the question is, if we wanted to put on the brakes at any one time, can we do it? And I think the answer is absolutely no. Not at the moment. We have no ability to do that. So how would we put on the brakes and stop further development? And do you have suggestions now, or should we be working on that now?
Thank you. Sorry, did you state who you were?
Robert Whitfield from the One World Trust.
Thank you. Very briefly, and then I want to take one final question, if I may. Anyone want to comment on that? Or is it more of a statement? I suppose, is there an off switch? Will we build in an off switch into...
Well, I think in part it's about the dissonance between, the capability in industry and in, the public sector to some extent. And how do we ensure that we get the best brains focused on some of the hardest challenges that are excited by the world of the public sector, like some of the professors we have in the Home Office, for example, who could be probably paid somewhere between 5 to 10 times more in the commercial sector. So I think we've got to excite those great thinkers to confront some of those big challenges and that dissonance that you described.
I'm going to push by luck, and the lady there right in the middle. Yes, and then that will have to be our last question, I'm afraid.
Thank you. I'm Renee van der Loop from the Engineering and Physical Sciences Research Council. This whole series of questions and talks was about next steps, what to do with the roadmap, national, international, and legal and legislation. And I was wondering, there's a whole host of new institutes and centers that have been set up. Office for AI, AI Council, Ada Lovelace, Center for Data Ethics, ATI, and so on. Do the panel, and maybe even the APPG members, know what their roles are going to be? How are they going to differentiate in this new landscape? Can we get a listing of
I think that is, I'm more than happy to let my panel try and answer that, but it's longer than the 1 or so minutes we have. Perhaps we need to map out as a group all these various organisations as well, but I don't know if anyone wants to comment on that.
Can I say, although it sounds fairly chaotic, I think we are at a pioneering point here at the moment, so I don't think it is undesirable to have different groups, maybe with overlap, maybe covering some of the same things. In fact, it is probably desirable, because what we don't want to do is to give one Uber panel committee control over the lots. That would seem dystopian to me. So I think although it is fairly ramshackle, I say at the moment,
complex.
I think it's good.
I think we'll use the word complex.
I think it's a really good thing, and government should be investing more into looking at all of these different areas through a multidisciplinary, cross-disciplinary approach.
Thank you very much. Unfortunately, time, as is always the case, is our enemy and has beaten us. I'm sure we could have carried on much longer, but I'm going to draw things to a close. Can I thank my fantastic panel? And can I thank all of you for joining us, and I look forward to welcoming you to another meeting of the All-Party Parliamentary Group on AI very soon. Thank you very much.